This is Dan, and you're watching The Salty Sea. I was hoping to wait for the Soulblight Gravelords guide until they showed out the Cruel Boys and new Stormcast stuff for the Dominion box set, but looks like they're gonna wait a little while to bring the Warcry rules for that in. So I thought I'd do just a mini guide on that and one of my favorite Cities of Sigmar too. So let's just jump right into it with the Soulblight Gravelords. They're a total rework of Legions of Nagash that sort of with the fall of Nagash and Broken Realms tech list, there's this whole sort of resurgence of vampires that's happening and them taking control of the Death Rattle legions. Necromancers are in there too. It's a pretty cool force. A lot of the new materials that they've released for it are pretty fun, and it's totally a new rework of the faction. So if you look at the leaders, they've changed the stats on some, including some of the points. The Vargoyle Castellan, which is the Blood Knight leader, and the Vampire Lord, which got a really cool new sculpt recently. That kind of Tilda Swinton with crazy bat hair sculpt. I really like it. I know not everyone does. But all three of those have really interesting stat lines. They all have, if you kind of look here in this tank rating column, they all have pretty good tankiness just in general, really hard to kill, and they're all pretty quick, right? The Vampire Lord is the slowest at 5 movement, but even that is pretty quick, and it flies, so that's going to help you in a lot of situations. So that ability to kind of move across the board and just plonk yourself in place and be really hard to kill, is a really nice contrast with the kind of super slow blenders, right? Like Graveguard are just like do a ton of damage, but move really slowly, that you get in the units section. So that can be really good in anything where they have to kill your leader and you have to kill theirs, or, blood marked and killing theirs, where you can kind of play keep away really well with your leader while your regular units just like make short work of the other guys. Some notable abilities here. So the Vargoyle can get an extra move or attack after a kill. It doesn't have the greatest killing power on its own. You know, dealing 6 to toughness 4, dealing 7 and a third to toughness 3, that's pretty respectable. Certainly nothing wrong with that, but point for point, that's not very good. And it requires some setup. So it's going to be really hard to move once and attack something and kill that thing on the first try. So you're going to have to kind of get into combat with something, which is okay because it's pretty tough. It's usually going to survive. But all I'm saying is that it just requires a turn of setup. It's not as clean as it might look on paper. Then the Castellan and the Vampire Lord, they both get a really excellent area of effect damage buff for all your minions. Or sorry, not minion rune mark, just, little guys. So that can be really useful, especially if you're not going to bring an abhorrent Archregent or abhorrent Ghoul King ally. If I wasn't going to bring an ally, I'd probably use the Castellan or the Vampire Lord. As is, I think the Vargoyle is the best, best being in quotes because everyone's goals are different. But as far as like winning competitive, I would say the Vargoyle is the best leader that you have available. But don't count out the Necromancer. It has an insane combo with Graveguard, giving extra moves and attacks. It does require a quad, though, so on any given round, there's only a 37% chance of it working, and your chances of never getting it are actually pretty high in a in a 3-round game where, say, in the first round it wouldn't do anything. Now you're looking at really only 2 chances to get huge value out of it. I don't love building around most quads for that reason, but for fun, even in competitive, it's still worth doing because you're not auto losing the games without it. But it's just dangerous. You're living with a gamble. So let's look over their units, right? So this is a mini guide, so I'm not going to do sort of a big tactical guide to how to use each unit, but I do want to do like a quick overview because I think there's some really interesting stuff here. So first of all, with the Lumineth Realm Lords release that they did, the article Call of the Everchosen that showed all their stats, they had some really interesting changes to the move 3, the big stone hammer guys that are in that faction, that showed that they were thinking about what it takes to make move 3 units playable. And I think that this particular release shows that they're taking that up to 11. The Graveguard and the Skeletons and the Deadwalker Zombies, they're all incredibly pushed stats-wise for their points, which I think is, I have reservations in this case I'll get into in a second, but I think in general that's really good. It's showing that, GW is at least playtesting this game, noticing that move 3 fighters are just really hard to use effectively in your games, can be really frustrating to try to play with, as pieces. Um, and so they're just like really amping up the incentives to make them easier to use. And I think that's great. Just in general, I think that's great. I think um, if you love Fire Slayers, for example, you're really looking forward to the next release that GW puts out, because they're clearly rethinking how they're going to use or how they're going to treat slow move 3 warbands. The reservation I've got is that Games Workshop has clearly not figured out the chaff problem. Um, I'd say about 90% of Warcry's sub 80-point fighters are just grievously problematically undercosted once you get to the competitive side of the game. Now, if you're in the casual game, right, if you're running, say, boxed sets against each other, like, the specific to Warcry sets against each other, or just like, budget versions of these war bands against each other, it's really not a big deal. But if you're going to min-max, things like the 70-point Graveguard are just absurd in terms of their efficiency compared to, the average unit in the game. So, I have this thing here. I don't like using, quote unquote fightiness. I don't like using this stat to evaluate leaders, because leaders are doing so much more for you. The way they work in different missions really matters as far as, which ones you're going to use. All of that is really important. The abilities can be sort of much swingier with leaders, so I don't like just going and adding up the damage efficiency, tank rating, projection, and modifiers specifically for evaluating them. But for units, I think it's a really good shortcut. It doesn't tell the entire story, but it does tell most of it. And look how much higher Graveguard are in terms of efficiency than everything else. I'd say anything above an 18 is totally playable, in this shorthand, and anything above a 19 is really good. So again, look at these all other cheap guys, also just really good. Anything 20 and above is borderline broken, I would say. So in general, they've just really pushed the quality of the cheap units, the quality of the cheap units in this, in this faction, which is somewhat flavorful, right? The fluff works, right? Because Soulblight Gravelords are all about their, death rattle hordes, but I still don't really love it, in terms of the effect it has when both players are playing competitively. It can create for kind of tedious games, which I think is too bad. Now, that being gone, there's some other really cool stuff here, especially if you're willing to, not necessarily always go for the most competitive option. First being the Verkos Bloodborne. Now, they have this 1-5, 1 damage when it's not a crit, 5 damage when it is a crit stat line that I really don't love. I've complained multiple times. I wish they'd make toughness matter more. I wish they'd have more damage in regular hits, less damage in crits. That's a whole nother video. I think, though, that in terms of the average damage that these guys will do, even though it's incredibly swingy, compared to like their movement, their hit points, if you did pick up a box of Cursed City, I think you're going to have a lot of fun with these guys. I think you're really going to be rewarded. I think that the Blood Knights, stat-wise, they're not the most efficient to go along with their leader, who I think is really good. So that part's kind of too bad if you wanted to run an all Blood Knight force. But Having one Blood Knight, I think, can still really work. They're really tanky for their points. They're hard to kill, which I think is great. The Vargeist, um, the previous version of it had much better killing stats. This one just really struggles with damage output. That said, move 8 flyers that are hard to kill, right? 30 hit points on that beast. Still really useful. Gets a good score here, but I wouldn't maybe run it if you were already running a Vargoyle. So the only way I'd really run it is if I was interested in a different leader for other reasons, and then I'm just thinking I want a big flyer. Then I'd put the Vargeist in, but otherwise I wouldn't jump to it. Um, the Skeleton Knights are pretty solid too, Black Knights and Hell Knights, just because they're so much cheaper than the Blood Knights, and they do um, a lot of that job, right? For significantly fewer points. Seneschals in Legions of Nagash were really solid. They're still just as good now. The thing is, Graveguard them going down to 70 points is absurd, right? So a Seneschal just being a more elite Graveguard, it just doesn't make as much sense as it did when Graveguards were 85 points. Now, it's really funny, right? I spoke in a couple Caradron Overlords videos about how I thought that the Argonaut Company with Spear was just a better Graveguard, and I didn't understand why everyone was so excited about Legions of Nagash when Caradron Overlords has access to a guy who's just a strictly better version of the exact same thing. But then, of course, GW goes and drops the points by a million on the Graveguard. So that part, all of those videos are moot now, which is fine. The game is supposed to evolve. So some quick abilities to talk about. Shambling Horde gets you great value on Graveguard and Seneschals, just as far as getting them into position. Shambling Horde is the one where if they're within a certain distance of the leader, they can move equal to the value of the ability. They only move 3 inches anyway, so half the time your free movement is actually going to be more than their normal move, which is great. Vampiric Agility is going to be really nice. If you have the Virkos Bloodborne from Cursed City, essentially paying a double to essentially give them fly for a turn is really useful. So let's talk about playstyle, right? So they have, if you got Cursed City, Soulblight Gravelords have a ton of variation, right? You can, I know the ogre zombies aren't very good, but like they have a real playstyle to them. So like you can play those, you can play the Virkos Bloodborne, you can play the Blood Knights. The Skeleton Horde is sort of the old Legions of Nagash thing. You can do that. You can also just like have big flying monsters with just a Vargoyle and a bunch of Vargeists if you want. There's incredible variation with what you can do with Soulblight Gravelords, which I think is really cool. Though a lot of it does push you towards having a big skeleton horde. So tons of skeletons or zombies, tons of Graveguard. You can do Necromancer combos. I didn't show a Necromancer list here, but Van Hell's Dance Macabre, like I mentioned before, incredible quad ability. The combo's great with the Graveguard. If I were getting competitive with these, I would want to bring in an Abhorrent Ghoul King as the ally, and I'd want to use the Vargoyle. The Ghoul King has the best movement buff available as an ally to death, and then the Vargoyle has the ability to just fly around, cause chaos. It's the best stat line you can get if you're bringing in an ally for your sort of cleverness abilities. The Castellan, and the Vampire Lord, I think that AoE buff is great, but if you're bringing in an abhorrent, you really don't need it. So then I would pair the Vargoyle and the Ghoul King with 5 Graveguard and 4 Skellies. Normally, I go with really weighting towards the cheapest chaff unit, but Graveguard are just so absurd, so ridiculously good, that it's even worth passing up the ability to completely flood and have 15 units on the board with skeletons or zombies, just because Graveguard really are that good. The debate between Skellies and Zombos, it's really close, whether you prefer the extra two hit points of the zombies versus the extra damage of the skeletons. I would be tempted to go zombies just because you're getting your damage from your Graveguard, but you know, extra damage from skellies is also really good. I wouldn't uh, blame anyone for choosing that. Um, you can do it like an all vampires list, right? If you do a Castellan and a bunch of Virkos. I think the Virkos are really, really good. So I just wanted to put a list that had a bunch of them in here to kind of show what you could do with them. Um, they, you know, they only suffer from just not being quite as good as Graveguard. Lots of lower tier factions, if you put Virkos in them, all of a sudden every list would be all Virkos. All right, so with the newest hotness out of the way, I do want to just go through some thoughts on one of the Cities of Sigmar I had. Um, I think that, the cities section of the order book is really, really cool. You get so many options. There's so many options for sort of ways to, attack the fluff of your warband. I think that the Phoenicium color scheme is all right. It's not my favorite, but it's pretty good. Um, but there's just like a ton to dig into with just the fluff of that city that I really like with the narrative, and their abilities are really interesting too. So the way Cities of Sigmar work in Warcry, if you don't already know, is each city has a unique universal double, a unique triple that's only for leaders. And by the way, when I say universal double, I mean anything in the warband can use it as long as you've chosen that city. Um, then they all have a unique quote unquote mystic quad that just only sorcerers can use. So the triple and the quad you're not really going to pay attention to with Phoenicium. With most of these, the interaction between the double and the triple are the ones that really create the playstyle. But for the Phoenicium, it's just all about the double, which is an incredible value when you're getting it to work. So the double is called Vengeful Revenants. A fighter can use this ability only if a friendly fighter has been taken down this battle round. This fighter that makes a bonus attack action that has range characteristic 3 or less. So if you've had someone die, and this is Warcry, fighters die all the time, um, then you get an entire extra attack action for just a double. That's half a rampage for just a double. You can, with wild dice, your chances of getting into a situation where you can create 3 doubles is actually really high. So you can create it where, you force them to kill a thing just by being in their face attacking them. And then once they kill it, you get 3 of this Vengeful Revenant's ability. You can just explode damage all over the board. So the first thing you want, if you're going to build with the Phoenicium in mind, is Sacrificial Lambs. So the ability only triggers after a friendly unit dies. So we need to be able to put Sacrificial Cannon Fodder in every deployment zone. So I'd say 3 is the absolute minimum that you can use. I think the 2 best options are Flagellants and Corsairs. So I've shown everything below 80 points that you really don't care at all if it dies um, here in the bottom. So if you want to use Dark Shards, you certainly can. Free Guild Guard are totally reasonable here. But what I like about Flagellants and Corsairs is that they both have a slightly higher damage output than Free Guild Guard, and they and I think that's really good because you want your attackers to be more threatening to force them to want to kill them. Then the debate is really just between whether you prefer the extra movement on Corsairs versus the 2 extra hit points on Flagellants. The extra move combos better with the Phoenicium ability, but I could see arguing for a mix because if you start playing it and you start really understanding where you need to put units to force trades, you could definitely find situations where they're being incentivized to kill your units anyway. So actually having the extra 2 hit points just makes that harder, and that could be really useful. And certainly Flagellants fit the fluff really well. So I would lean Corsairs to start, but I wouldn't be surprised if once you've been playtesting a ton, you take out 1 of your Corsairs for a Flagellant or even 2 Corsairs for a Flagellant. Then once you've put your Sacrificial Lambs in, you're going to want payoffs. So you want elites with really high damage per activation, because that's who gets the most benefit from just getting a free attack activation. So for leaders, my personal favorite choice is the Anointed. which fits the narrative really well as well because it's from the Phoenix Temple, so it just kind of fits perfectly. It has really high damage, doing 6 to DPA 4, 7.33. I've said before that that's not enough for sort of 200 point plus fighters, but at only 190, that's actually pretty respectable damage efficiency. And it has range 2, which means that you can help keep it out of danger, and you're more likely to be able to do something like, let's say you get that bonus attack action, you kill something, now you've got these other activations, you want to find something else to fight, you're more likely to be in range of something. I put in Assassins and Keepers here too because they have similarly, pretty solid damage per activation, and um, they're cheaper, which is, sometimes really good if you're trying to min-max. Then as far as elites that aren't leaders, I think Wildwood Rangers, Executioners, and Wild Riders all work really well here. They all have pretty low tank rating, which is totally fine, right? Because you want your units dying anyways. And they all really threaten to explode with damage if they're not dealt with, because of this way that you can give them an extra activation. And they're all pretty quick too, so you can get them straight into the opponent's face, force them to deal with them, then trigger the ability, start getting a ton of work in there. Allies can also be really effective for this faction. Of all the Cities of Sigmar factions, I would say Tempest Eye is probably still the best one overall, but um, the one that makes the best use of allies is probably either the Phoenicium or Living City, with Phoenicium probably leaning towards being even better than Living City. So, uh, any ally in order that just deals a ton of damage can be really good. So the Bloodrack Medusa, the Lord Celestant, a ton of foot slogging um, allies that if you get them into position, they just explode with damage, can be great here. If you're not going to go allies, something like the Anointed, 2 Executioners, 3 Wildwood Rangers, and 5 Corsairs can be really solid. You have 11 bodies, so you don't mind losing them. Um, you have 6 different fighters who are really happy to use the ability, who get you really good value. And I think that that's huge, right? Because you can threaten it anywhere on the board. One kind of narrative list here would be kind of an evil Phoenix list with an assassin, Bloodrack Medusa, Executioner, and 7 Corsairs, right? That's very sort of Marathi themed. And the Bloodrack Medusa is really good with Phoenicium because their main thing is trying to spam this double. But if you just roll a triple, a natural triple, you're going to want to use it on something, with good value. So having Bloodrack Stare there, can just be really powerful because it's not fighting for dice with your main ability. Plus, Bloodrack Medusas actually do get huge value out of the Phoenicium double. All right, so there you have it. A couple mini guides there for Warcry. If you made it this far, please hit like. Helps other people find the channel who also play Warcry, more likely to pop up on their feed. That can be good for just growing the community around this game in general. So please do. Otherwise, I plan to be bringing out another one of these mini guides as soon as they bring out the stats for Cruel Boys and the new Stormcast. So you can see that I'll probably be, maybe just a few days after they release that, I should be able to have something up. Otherwise, I might do some more narrative focused things for the next video since this one was pretty tactically heavy on list building. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.